Before the revolution, Cuba was much like other Latin American countries, meaning it was a banana republic controlled by the US. The dictator Batista seized power illegally in 1952 and failed to implement the reforms he rose to power on, and instead implemented brutal measures to keep control over the people. Terrible conditions for the Cuban people were widespread, and poverty and social polarization were very common, as well as high unemployment. The economy was dependent on the sugar industry, as that's what the American businesses had invested in, and there were high amounts of corruption. Cubans were heavily oppressed by the federal government, especially minorities and women. Batista took a drastic, aggressive measures to maintain his regime, and this resulted in massive unpopularity among the Cuban people. Fidel Castro was but a wee lad at the time, but took notice of the massive exploitation and oppression under the Batista regime. So in 1953, him and his brother Raul led 160 soldiers to attack the barracks in Santiago de Cuba, and this was known as the 26th of July movement. They were easily thwarted and imprisoned. 2 years later, in 1955, they were exiled to Mexico, where they would meet their new best friend, Che Guevara. The newly radicalized Fidel Castro invaded Cuba again in 1958 with his brother Che Guevara and a group of other Cuban radicals, who then started a guerrilla war in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which would leverage massive support from the poor farmers of the countryside. This would eventually depose Batista on January 1st, 1959, when Batista fled to the Dominican Republic. Castro then would start to implement changes which would benefit his main supporters, who were women, poor people, and minority groups in Cuba. Castro sought out to reform Cuba initially and sought help from both the US and the USSR. Yet this would not last for a long time, because Castro's opinions would favor socialism much more than capitalism. Though Castro enjoyed a couple months of lukewarm relations with the US, this quickly deteriorated after Castro decided to nationalize the American businesses that lived inside Cuba. This was because Castro wished to use the wealth produced by Cubans and Cuban enterprises to better benefit the people instead of foreign investors. After being skeptical of Castro from the onset, America was now very, very displeased with the new leader, who had essentially crippled American economic interests in the Caribbean and stopped them from having their main sugar exporter. This resulted in large amounts of U.S. interventionism, including a meeting where the U.S. refused to allow Castro to have an autonomous government, even if he was willing to not side with the Soviets. The icy relations turned hostile in 1961 when the U.S. government funded an open coup against Castro called the Bay of Pigs invasion, where Cuban exiles were sent to Cuba to overthrow Castro. This coup was predicated on the idea that the Cuban people would join with the exiles and try to overthrow Castro, who had taken over a couple years earlier. But this failed, as the Cuban people had a massive amount of support for Castro, and the US government did not support their rebels properly. This was the final nail in the coffin of US-Cuban relations and further pushed Castro into the Soviet camp, and he soon adopted Marxist-Leninism as the official state ideology. After outstanding relations with one another, the Cubans and Soviets decided to take their alliance one step further and engage in mutual aid, as well as the Soviets placing missiles in Cuba to counterbalance the American missiles in Turkey. This would result in the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the highest level of Cold War tensions to ever happen, as well as the closest humans have ever come to total nuclear annihilation, with Kennedy and Khrushchev both wanting to finger that button so hard and blow everyone up. Yep. This was the closest we got, and our boy Fidel Castro was right in the middle of it. While Castro was famous internationally for being a fervor-filled revolutionary, he was much more interested in securing the rights and security of his people in Cuba, particularly women and Afro-Latinos, who had been severely disadvantaged under Batista's regime. He provided free schooling, literacy training, and jobs to all people that could get them, and generally provided equality to those who were marginalized under the previous capitalist system. Women and Afro-Latinos were now allowed into fields that usually only men of Caucasian descent in Cuba could occupy, such as managers or public servants. Now that such a large percentage of the population had been included into the workforce, and were not marginalized within the workforce, productivity increased drastically, as people could be appointed and promoted based on merit and not based on ethnicity, gender orientation, or racial creed. This resulted in solidarity, workplace cooperation, and a general increase in productivity and standards of living and workplace life. Literacy rates among the poor, women, and minorities also increased as the Cuban government provided free education not only for children, but also for any person that did not feel like their current level of education was adequate. They also brought electricity to the countryside, public housing, as well as subsidized standards of living so each person could have a decent life within Cuba, regardless of who they were before the revolution. The political landscape of Cuba was dominated by the Cuban Communist Party headed by Fidel Castro from 1961 onwards, and the Cuban Communist Party served as the revolutionary vanguard of the state, establishing socialism and other elements of radical left thought both practically and ideologically inside the people. Cuba also exported the revolution to other countries in Latin America and Africa, and supported the political aspirations of most of its citizens, as the citizenry soon supported the communist ideology very heavily. Castro began to not only be beloved within Cuba, but also as an international figure of socialist revolution. The main concern of Cuba's economic development was the establishment of socialism from a previously capitalist economy, where they used to just export things for sale on the international markets. Cuba now focused on production of goods and food needed internally as to stimulate growth for the people. This happened in one of two ways: the public sector, which was run by the state, where people were given quotas and managed themselves, or in communes, where people functioned independently and had a large degree of self-autonomy and worker self-management. Both of these were employed to create a socialist economy. But arguably, Cuba's most important economic development was the way they went away from using money as a way to facilitate growth and commerce within the economy. Instead of using money and paying people wages, Cuba focused more on the goods people needed to survive, and thus provided them directly through the state in exchange for their work in certain fields. Everyone then got what they needed and gave what they could in exchange. This allowed for people in Cuba to not have to worry about individual finance or personal gain, but instead focus on developing themselves within the economy as well as developing the economy. This built worker solidarity as well as a heightened sense of nationalism within Cuba. Cuba's main accomplishments were centered around the establishment of socialism and the improvement of the standard of living of its people. Hunger, illiteracy, and discrimination of any kind were abandoned in Cuba because of legislative action done by the Communist Party, and free housing, education, a guaranteed right to work, as well as public health care were all mainstays and still are within Cuba, as they are rights of every citizen within the country. These are all free, and thus a massive success in the eyes of the Cuban people, as these are not common in most of Latin America. Or to say it simply, Cuba's successes are its equality for all and its establishment of socialism in Latin America, which had never been done before. Cuba's main failings often emit from its political homogeny. The fact that the Communist Party controls most every political aspect in the country means dissent and free speech are often stifled, as this is seen as a threat to Cuba's national security because imperialists could find a way to infiltrate it. Also, there have been failings in that Cuba has often oppressed its people unintentionally or intentionally, as before 1979 homosexuals were seen as enemies of the state because it was viewed as bourgeois. Though this was corrected, initially this was a massive failure. Castro's vision of Cuba is a controversial one, but few can argue that Cuba is much better off under him than it was Batista, and that many of the progressions that Cuba has had are attributed directly to its socialist economy and way of doing things. Cuba is one of the few nations to maintain this and is very unique for that. Thank you for watching my crash course of Viva la Revolucion, and remember kids, get crunk!